And I'll keep an eye on some of the late entry people that come in. So it's my honor to introduce you to Helen Salita. She joined the ACL of Delaware in January of this past year, graduating from the University of Mary, Washington. She spent a number of years with Sojourners in Washington, D.C., and she supported a number of legislative and advocacy campaigns over the past few years, and was very much involved in the 2020 election season, where she helped as an assistant canvass director and field organization for the Roots campaign. So with that, this evening, we're really going to talk about voting rights and voting issues. And I want to welcome Helen, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Fantastic. I am so glad to be here speaking with all of you today. A little bit about voting rights, the work that I'm doing, the work the ACLU is doing, and then happy to answer any questions. That being said, if you have any questions during my chat and you're like, I'm going to lose this thought if I don't say it right now, feel free to either like raise your hand or, just unmute and start talking, and I will be happy to answer that as we go along. So just so you all have a little bit of an idea, I'm going to obviously be talking about voting rights today. I'm going to talk a little bit about school board elections, and then kind of a little bit more generally about what are the ACLU's plans, what are our priorities, what are we doing on behalf of you all and of voters here in Delaware. So can anyone tell me what was special about this past Tuesday? Yeah, Sandy? Oh, you're muted.
School board elections.
Yes, that is right. I am so glad that you know that, because based on voter turnouts, not many people in Delaware seem to know that those elections were going on. Does anyone know what a school board does, what they're responsible for? Feel free to just shout it out if you have any guesses, any thoughts. Well, if you don't know, school boards essentially operate as like the governing body of school districts. And so they manage the budget of millions of dollars. They make sure that resources are allocated across districts, are responsible for making sure schools have what they need. They hire superintendents. They set all kinds of policy, from sort of general district policy to helping shape educational policy. And so they have a really crucial job in basically setting up sort of the education that students in their district receive. As I'm sure you all are aware, over the past few years across the country, and even here in Delaware, we've seen school boards become a focus of a lot of attention. A lot of politics have sort of been played out at that really micro level. And we've seen, all sorts of candidates running for school board. It would be probably a little funny if it wasn't so absolutely terrifying, the power they would have. And so the other thing that's really worrying is not only are we seeing, these fringe candidates who are more interested in kind of politics than education, and, speaking for a small fringe part of the community as opposed to all the community, in pursuit of that agenda, we're seeing a real try to roll back kind of the civil liberties of students. And so that's really concerning for us at the ACLU when we are hearing people talk about banning books, or not affirming all students regardless of however they identify, or who they love, or what their background is. That's really worrying for us, that we are seeing these trends in the country. We're seeing these trends here in Delaware, and because turnout is so low, if you can get 10 more people to show up, then like you can easily sway an election. And so because we've been sort of keeping a pulse on all that, we decided this year that we really wanted to begin getting involved in school boards, to make sure that we are keeping an eye on things. And so, I was really happy, and sort of the races that we were involved in, we kind of chose races, based on, who are those candidates who are a little very worrying, and who are people that we had. And I'm really glad to see that, voter turnout was higher in certain elections. That being said, I can't think of a race that had a ton of votes. I think the highest race of the election, the highest race of kind of the elections that we were really involved in, had less than 5,000 people vote in the school district, which is, really, really sad for all the power that these elections have. And so, Susan, did you have a question? I thought I saw you on mute.
No? Oh, I'm sorry.
You're good. You're good. I just wanted to make sure that I was ready.
Well, I did have a thought about your comment and asking. I mean, there is a lot of power in the school board because they have approval and disapproval and all kinds of things. They hear cases of all as we constantly read. So school boards have become much more of a reality in our lives. I think especially in the last couple of years. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think school boards in general, are really important, but so are these local elections, which never get as much attention as, they really should. National elections are important. Statewide elections are important, and you should go vote in all your elections. I want to be clear about that. But while those sort of bigger races get all this attention, it's really the decisions your school board makes, the decision your town council makes, that really impact your day-to-day life. And so that's why, it's so important that, we have people paying attention to these elections. People really know, what needs to happen to be able to register to vote. Where do I go to vote? When is election day? Because in terms of school boards, who thinks about going to cast a vote in May? You associate voting with November, which makes sense. And so making sure that people really know, and keeping an eye on the local level where people don't get a lot of attention, and they do have these opportunities for sort of these candidates who want to take a step back, we really do keep an eye on them and we get people out to vote. And so I was really encouraged, we did see an uptick in voting. We've seen that over the last couple of years. We want to continue that growth, and we really want to see more districts become more competitive, have better races, because ultimately, regardless of how elections go, we really do think having that race is important. Having as many people get out and vote is important, because we want those conversations. We want people to be able to have choices and think about, like, what is best for me? What is best for my community? Because that is what voting is, essentially. And so we want to see races. We want to see people involved at all levels. And so I'm really excited to be doing school board works, and excited to be talking about them and just generally make sure people know that they're happening, that they're aware that they're going on, and to sort of stay engaged in the election and even past the election. It's really, really critical to not just show up once, but to make sure we're showing up all the time, as absolutely exhausting as it can be in the world that we are currently living in. So thank you for listening to my spiel about school boards. As coming out of the work that we've been doing on them Tuesday, they are pretty much always on my mind. Yeah, Roger.
I had a question about how you get on a ballot for a school board. I don't recall signing a petition. I don't recall doing anything for people coming around saying, well, I'm running for school board. I'd like to have a signature on this paper. So how does that work in Delaware?
Yeah, so what you would do if you are interested in running for school board, as I understand the process to be, is you would go to the Department of Elections website, you would fill out, they have like a filing packet of information, your name, where do you live, that sort of information. You have to get it notarized, and then a new requirement that has been added within the last year or so is you then have to go and you have to get a background check through the criminal history background check. I can't remember exactly what it's called, as well as the Child Protective Service check. And assuming those come back good, you've paid the fine, nothing gets flagged there, then you are a candidate for your local school board. So it's a pretty easy process. You don't have to go around collecting, X amount of signatures to get on. In one sense, it's easy. In another sense, with the new background requirement, I know that's something for a couple of reasons that's a little worrying to me, a little worrying to the ACLU, both background checks in general. Let's just be real, there is a little bit of a racial component in our criminal justice system. And so there are, certain groups that definitely background checks, historically hurt more. And so we struggle with that. We also don't like that. I mean, it doesn't necessarily allow for second chances. Let's say, you made some pretty big mistakes. But we still believe that like people have the capacity to change. People can make good choices, can be better people than they were before. And so just because you did something 5 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever the case may be, you still have that chance to, have turned your life around, and that shouldn't necessarily, keep you from being able to sit on your school board. So we have worries about that. We also have worries in terms of the background checks. For the two checks, I think it's something close to $80 or so to be able to run, which doesn't sound like a lot for some people, but that is a lot of money for other individuals. And so I know of at least 2 candidates this year who were worried they weren't going to be able to file because they just couldn't come up with the money right away. And we definitely don't think that because you are maybe from a more low income area, family, that doesn't mean that you wouldn't be a phenomenal school board member. And so for a lot of reasons, sort of that background check requirement, that is sort of the other thing that you have to do to run for school board. There really are some equity issues there that concern us. We're still trying to figure out what we want to do about it. This was the first year that it was really required. And so it threw a lot of confusion into the system for everyone. We weren't sure. It wasn't well publicized that was coming, or that change had happened and was coming. And so it's too late to do anything about it this year, but definitely something we want to keep our eye on going forward, and think about, how do we want to reform this? What do we want that to look like? So shifting gears just a little bit to talk about general voting rights. I know that's why you all asked me to come. So, the whole premise of, doing voting rights is to really open up our democracy. We were founded on this great democracy view of like everyone, can have a vote and should have a say, and, no taxation without representation. And we have great ideals, and we have never really lived up to them. We have always tried to keep certain groups, certain people from voting, from being able to participate, in order to hold power within a small group of individuals. We obviously don't think that should happen. We, want as many people as possible participating, or at least having that choice to participate. We can't force you to the ballot box, but we can make sure that you have that ability if you so choose. We see that every person, is worthy of voting. Every person has a voice. Every person has the right to make the decisions for what's best for them, for what's best for their community. And so that's what we're all about, is trying to make sure that we keep expanding voting rights, expanding access to these things, and pushing back where people are trying to encroach on that, as we have seen efforts all across the U.S. of new ways, as old literacy tests and poll texts have given ways to voter IDs and signatures. People have just gotten craftier in how they're trying to prevent people from getting to the polls. And so we have to be just as diligent, making sure that these polls remain open for everyone. Because like I said, like when we can all participate, when we can all vote, that raises all of us up together. It doesn't diminish anyone's abilities. It actually betters all of us. And so that's sort of the bedrock of the reason we're doing this work, and what we're doing. So then the next kind of logical place is sort of, what does the state of voting reform, voting rights reform look like here in Delaware? And the answer is, it's in a really tricky spot right now. How many of you recall hearing last year that there was legislation signed around vote by mail and same-day registration? Yeah, people remember hearing about that. Do you remember hearing a little while later about the Supreme Court case here in Delaware? Yeah. So we had, that great win. I wasn't in Delaware when that happened, but the coalition we work with really closely, the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition, came together around, vote by mail, same day registration, and were ecstatic to pass it. And then absolutely heartbroken when it was ruled unconstitutional. If you're not familiar, particularly with vote by mail, the state constitution states 6 reasons that a person is able to vote by mail. You're out of the country, you're sick, you're disabled, religious teachings keep you from voting on that day. There are a couple other reasons. And if you don't fall into one of those 6 categories, well, then you can't vote by mail. One thing I know that was really heartbreaking about this rule changed in the middle of the election cycle last year. I think that rule was in place for the primaries, but by the time the general election had come around, those had been taken out. So a lot of confusion, and did take away a lot of access and ease that a lot of people had when voting. It's really convenient to be able to send out for your ballot, get it in, just mail it. You don't have to think about, transportation. Is the voting place accessible for me? Even if it is accessible, are they going to open the right door? Are people, not going to park in the disabled spot? Are, the pollsters working that day going to know how to work your voting machine? You don't have to deal with that. You can just mail in your ballot. And so it's really convenient. And same with same day registration. We want people to be able to vote instead of having to remember, 30 days out or 60 days out or whenever the deadline is here. Am I registered? It doesn't matter. You should just be able to show up and vote and get on that list. We really don't see any instances of voter fraud. And so, there are no reasons we shouldn't have this expanding access to the polls. So I know that there is some current litigation going on around early voting. It's not moving very quickly. And as my head of legal says, no news is good news right now. And so we're definitely keeping an eye on what happens around early voting. But again, we want it. People shouldn't have to necessarily wait in long lines on voting day if they don't want to. If you want to go vote in 5 minutes, 2 weeks ahead of the election or whenever, you should be able to do that. It shouldn't be a really big issue. And so that's left us in a really current spot because, we can go and try and pass all the legislation that we want, but we're really having to think now, okay, well, are they going to take a really strict, understanding of the state constitution? Are we going to go through all the work to get a bill done, get it through the House, get it through the Senate, get the governor to sign it, and then instantly having it taken away? Well, we don't know. And so what we're really thinking about is sort of how do we best reform this sort of system? And so right now, what we're really thinking about is going to have to happen is the creation of a constitutional amendment. If we amend the Constitution, well, then it's done. It's there. We don't have to worry about the courts telling us it's unconstitutional because it's in the Constitution. May not be needed for necessarily every single reform, but for kind of the major ones we want to see, we thinking that's going to be kind of our best path forward. That being said, that is a really long process. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the process, but if you're not, you have to get it passed through both chambers at 2/3, a majority vote both times, and you have to get it done in 2 consecutive legislative sessions. And so by our math, we're thinking this is going to be a 3 to 5 year process. And so what we are really doing in sort of that post Supreme Court decision this year is there's not a ton going on in the world of voting reform in terms of bills. There are definitely some bills that, are small things, changes to town charters, potentially lowering the voting age for school board elections to be 16, kind of small things like that, but no major, big, expansive, wonderful voting act. And so what we're really doing right now is we're trying to figure out, okay, well, what are those issues that we most want to work on? So again, we know vote by mail is going to be one. We were so close, we had it, and then it was taken away. And same with early voting. We're pretty confident, again, that's something that we want to see happen. And so now what we're left with is sort of figuring out like what potentially could be some of the other issues that we're looking about. And so one of them, we're talking about is kind of reforming prison voting. I'm going to preface this session with I am not the expert on prison voting, so feel free to ask any questions. I'm not going to guarantee that I have an answer for you, but I can always talk. Our head of legal is really into this issue and sort of is specifically on prison voting my biggest help within the office. But when we're talking about prison rights, there are some people who, depending on what you're convicted of, you are disenfranchised for the rest of your life. And we don't think that should be the case. We don't think that you should, any action you do should automatically mean you never get a say in your community, in your country, in your state. We don't think that's right for individuals. Again, it doesn't allow necessarily for people to have changed. And even if, they haven't necessarily changed, that doesn't mean that they don't still have a voice. Plenty of people who don't make great decisions, who haven't done that, still get that right to choose. And again, it's a very clear, based on our criminal justice system, that minorities are really impacted by it. And so it's just another way to sort of keep groups of people who historically have been disenfranchised and are continuing to be disenfranchised. And so that's something we want to look at. Potentially. We also want to look at people who are on probation, aren't always able to vote. And at that point, you've come out, you've served your time for whatever you did, you're back out, you're doing other things, you should be able to vote. There are a lot of people right now on probation for a number of reasons. There are some people who are on probation right now who would be off, except for they can't pay whatever sort of their probation fine is. So again, those are people, potentially low-income individuals who are yet again being kept from the ballot box because of this fine, essentially. So again, we don't think money should be a barrier keeping people from voting. Also, people who are currently in prison should be able to vote. I think these stats, if I'm remembering correctly, for the portion of the prison population that's eligible to vote, in 2020, I believe one person attempted to cast a vote and was unable to, and in 2022 we had 3 people successfully cast a vote. So I'm glad we improved from 0 to 3, but there are, hundreds and hundreds of people who are perfectly able to vote, and the system is just set up in a way that they actually cannot vote. And so we're trying to figure out, how do we change that system? How do we enfranchise as many people as we can within the criminal justice system? So that's one thing we're really looking at right now, digging into sort of how do we untangle this mess that's going on there. Again, we want early voting. Another thing that we're really excited about, really trying to inform, is offering an expanse of sort of translation services at polling places. Obviously, especially down in Sussex where I live, we've seen a really big rise in immigrants, particularly sort of from Latin America. And so making sure that, there are people, ballots can be given in Spanish or whatever language people have. Even for just past Spanish, we want to make sure that everyone who can vote is able to vote and understand what's going on, understand the form, and all of that, and be able to vote, as well as making sure that, if they speak primarily another language, that they're able to talk with someone kind of at their polling place, or at least have resources there, even if someone can't speak to them, that can walk them through the process. Again, trying to make sure that language isn't a barrier for someone who is able to vote. And so those are some of the reforms that we are looking at enacting here in Delaware, because if we're going to go through a 3 to 5 year process, then we want to make sure that it's worth our time, that we are allowing as many people who right now either aren't able to vote because the law says that they have lost their right to vote, or should be able to vote, but for whatever reason the system isn't working, they aren't able to cast their vote. We really want to make sure that everyone can vote, and that we are going to get big wins for people if we are going through this process. So like I said, we are beginning that work, beginning those conversations. We've been having those conversations in-house, sort of beginning to have them with partners, because we don't want to go it alone. We want to make sure that partners are with us, and the people of Delaware are with us as we are going along this work. So those are kind of the remarks that I had prepared for you all in terms of sort of the work, what we're doing right now, what we're thinking about. And I wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time to sort of open it up for any kind of voting related questions that you all might have. I saw Jane,
Jane.
your hand first,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
Roger.
So presently, anyone in prison is not voting, cannot vote.
Essentially, that is how it is
Yeah.
working. There are some people in prison who, because of whatever they were convicted, whatever felony, have just lost the right to vote, have been disenfranchised. You can't vote. But then there are some people in prison who do still have the right to vote. They didn't lose it. But whether it's they're unable to get an absentee ballot, or there aren't polling places in prison. So like they can't go, physically to their prison place. Part of the thing that we're trying to figure out right now is prison isn't one of the reasons listed, the 6 reasons listed in the absentee, in the Constitution to be able to vote absentee. And so it's trying to figure out, well, how do we do that and make it work? And there's sort of a weird politics that goes around that's like, technically, we'll let they can vote, but how do you actually make that happen?
Okay. And so people on probation often can't vote because they owe fines or they owe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So by the law, I mean, people on probation can vote, but there are other circumstances that make it probable that they won't vote.
Yeah. So in terms of probation, and I'm also not the expert on all of that comes along with probation. My colleague, particularly John, does a lot of that. But essentially, there are some people who are on probation, and because of they're on probation, they aren't able to vote. Once they come off of probation, they can, but just while they're there, they're not able to. And for a lot of people, what is sort of leaving them on probation, they've served whatever their time was, they did, all the checks, all of that, but they just can't pay that money to get off of probation. That's sort of what's holding them. And it's not hard to imagine that happening because of all the checks and things that keep people who have been in prison from getting good jobs. And so it's just the fact that we have those fees that are keeping some people to vote, and money shouldn't be a barrier to be able to go and to cast your vote.
Okay. And I'm confused about early voting is different than mail-in voting, isn't
Yeah. So early voting, which was my favorite way to vote when I lived in Virginia. Essentially, I think it was something like there's a set amount of time before the election. You can't go to any voting place. Maybe you have to go to your county office or wherever. But you can show up when they're open and you just walk in and you cast your vote, which is a little different than a mail-in voting. There, you have to get your ballot sent to you. You fill it out at home. You sign, yep, it's me. And then you mail it back in and you're done. You don't have to go anywhere.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Roger?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I voted early, I guess, at the primary, the last primary, and it was not the local place. It was down in Newark at the post office, or next to the post office. So instead of Hockessin, where I am. But I guess that was dashed by the Supreme Court decision. Is there a current bill in the House or Senate in the legislature now on any voting issue, including the amending the Constitution?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there is HB 3 in the Senate, which essentially gives the General Assembly the power to create the rules and policies and procedures about absentee voting. Again, it's a constitutional amendment, so we're on the first leg of it. We don't have a lot of hope for its passage. I am just checking to make sure that see where it's at.
HB3 or SB3? HB3.
Sorry, SB3.
SB3, right.
Okay. And so it looks like it has passed in the Senate, which is great, over to the House, where it is going to have, I don't want to say zero chance, but not good. From our math, I I think last time we talked about it, it's been a little bit since we have really talked about it. Our best guess, and this goes for sort of any constitutional amendment, we're probably maybe two to three seats short right now in the House to get to 2/3 majority. And so that's the other part of sort of the strategy that we're thinking about right now. We can't start it next session. It's probably not going to go anywhere. So we're really figuring, not only do we need to be out talking to people about, what are the importance of voting rights, why do we want to see expanded voting reform and issues like that, but we also need to be doing some voting work for those who can vote, and really making sure that there are so many pressing issues right now for people to be considering, but making sure that voting rights is one of those, so that in the next election we can, get the people in the seats that we need them to be in, so that we are able to really get going on this process, and start getting a constitutional amendment in place. That being said, SB3, is chugging along, and if they're able to sort of get it passed and get it passed next session, and at least take absentee voting off of our plate for right now, that's great. But there's still more work to be done. And again, we're sort of thinking we don't want to do every issue by a constitutional amendment, because that would exhaust us all. If we can get kind of one and done, for at least right now, and then kind of go from there.
Well,
So that's
the other choice, of course. I talked to a lawyer about the last decision when the Supreme Court said it couldn't fly. He said that was based on something, I think, from the 1930s. That was, when you read about that ruling by the Supreme Court in the 1930s, it was like, well, that's pretty bogus. So the other alternative is to replace the Supreme Court in the state of Delaware. And then that's just, I'm just saying that that is a possibility, because things happen that way too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one possibility. I'll admit we haven't talked about it a lot, but I think what we've seen with the decisions the court's making here in Delaware, the court's making nationally at the Supreme Court level, is we don't want necessarily to have to rely on the judges to sort of set this precedent and go, because clearly they're going to make sort of decisions that they want, regardless of kind of what is precedent, what has been set. And so it's far better if we can not sort of rely on the court to just be like, oh, okay, that's fine. But really, if it is in the Constitution, if it is set in stone there, that, really doesn't force us to rely on those justices. Those rights are enshrined, those rights are there, and they would take a heck of a lot to get them removed at that point. And so, yeah, maybe some relief can come there, but I think long term, for the stability and the assurance of mind, getting something a little bit more concrete is always a good idea.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Helen, earlier in the conversation, you talked about, I think it was low outturn for voting. And it was like 4,000 to 5,000. Was that in Newcastle, or was that for all the 3 counties?
So that was for school board. I'm happy to say our voter turnout is better for primary and general elections. So the highest highest vote count of the 5 districts that we were really kind of paying attention to was a little under 5,000 votes.
Okay.
I have 4,666. That was sort of before the erase was officially certified. So there's a chance, the numbers may be slightly different, but they're not going to raise by, 100 votes or anything like that. So that was for, what district was that for? Red Clay, which is up here in Newcastle. And just, for that district, that is a 4.37 voter turnout rate. It is, I will say, the second highest voter rate that there's been in the past 3 years there, which is great. Again, the voting voting number of voters coming out is raising, which is great. But we want to see that higher. We want to see more participation from people across the board, but especially in school boards, especially in local elections, where it really impacts day to day.
Yeah. So you talked also about, what is it that can be done to improve this? And you talked about translations and other things, but what are some of the coalition tools that you guys are kind of promoting or looking to perform to kind of get more outcome on voting.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that we've really started, we had it for school board. So if you go to votedelaware.org right now, you'll see all of our school board information. We had it switched over from what it was in the general election last year, where it was about the general election. And it's sort of like a one-stop shop voting. You know, it tells you everything from what are the important deadlines you need to know, to how do you get an absentee ballot, to how do you find your polling places, to housing information about like, who are the candidates in your race? Have they taken our questionnaire? If so, what do they say? And we talk a bit about, you know, the issues. Why does your vote matter for this or for that? And so one thing we're really trying to do is have that, be able to share that out with our coalition, with our partners, with any and everyone that we can, to sort of be a quick, easy one-stop shop. I'll just go ahead and say now, because it's pretty great. We're starting to crunch the numbers for school board elections, and based on the number of people we know, unique individuals we know went to votedelaware.org for school boards, and the number of people who voted, we think that 1 out of every 10 people who voted went to our website, which is pretty great, which is a good way, a good percentage of people checking that out. I know, you know, other coalition partners, you know, again, also have websites, but that's only, you know, part of it. We have to be able to connect with the people to get them that information. And so we're doing all sorts of things, you know, trying to make sure that we're talking to as many groups as possible. We're expanding out. One thing that I'm doing, I'm also not just the voting rights manager, but I run our immigration campaign. And so particularly downstate and Sussex, we're really trying to build those partnerships so that people, you know, trust us and really know kind of the rights about voting, their rights, and sort of all of that information if they're a little newer. And so we're trying to expand out that way and make sure that we're casting as wide a net as possible, and we're talking to as many different groups as possible. So we're trying to think creatively about even, you know, the places that we're advertising. Of course, we're going to go, you know, Delaware Online, major sources. But this year for school boards, one thing that we tried that I think, well, we're still waiting to see how successful it was, but I was really glad we did it. How many of you have heard of the like neighborhood system Nextdoor? Yeah, so we had ads on Nextdoor. We were like, oh, there are families, there are people who are going to be involved. It can be, I think we once compared it to the Wild West. It can be an interesting place, but we're like, you know, we're trying to figure out where are people. One thing that we did for school boards a little differently, we've always done, you know, canvassing, but I said, you know, I've done canvassing in the past, not just door to door, but kind of out in public places. And so in the 2 weekends ahead of school board elections, we went to 3 public parks. And so we were like, well, as long as the weather is nice, you know, it's late April, early May, you know, we're likely to catch parents as they're taking kids to their playground, or if they have, you know, a little league game or a soccer game, or, you know, they're just out having fun. And so we were like, let's go talk to as many families as we can. And so we're trying all different ways to be on the ground in communities, just talking to people about voting rights, connecting them with the resources that we've already put together in order to build knowledge about, you know, the issues, but also just generally build knowledge about elections. Yeah.
Norm, we don't hear you, Norm. I'm not. Maybe your volume, because your mute's off.
Can't hear.
Okay.
Can you type your question in the chat?
All right, we'll go back to Norm. I think he's trying to find a partner to help with that. Any other questions coming to mind?
Question about the ACLU.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're a local or regional chapter?
So we are a state chapter.
State chapter.
Yeah, so we are the Delaware chapter. So obviously there's the big ACLU, the national ACLU, and then every state has at least one affiliate office. It's a really great relationship where we sort of have, the ability to sort of do our own things, follow our own policies, but we always have national there if we have questions, if we need advice, if we want to talk strategy. They're there to give us any and all support, and we're really lucky to have their support as we were, kind of a test case for ACLUs on school boards. And so they sort of came alongside us and were instrumental in the work that we did.
On a national level, can you speak to anything on the national level, in particular the electoral count versus a popular vote for president? I don't know what is the ACLU in favor of a presidential popularity vote versus an electoral college vote, or don't you know a national policy?
I don't know National's position on that. It's not something I have looked a lot about that we're talking about here in Delaware. And so I am not gonna speak for National on that one. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Norm, any success? Doesn't look like.
Oh.
Okay. Well, you can write it up and we can get back to Helen at some point. So just forward it off to me or Susan and we'll take care of it. Any other questions at this time? Okay, Susan.
So Helen, you mentioned very briefly this, as a 16, 17-year-olds voting in school board elections. And I know it's just one of many things that you're concerned with, but what is your take on that? I mean, I read an article, an editorial about the importance of it because it helps students of that age who are having civics in high school, and they can benefit from having this opportunity to actually vote in a school board election. What is your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our partners within the DVRC, the Delaware Voting Rights Coalition, Claire at Common Cause, this is really an issue that she is championing on. That being said, we definitely support the bill, the issue allowing 16, 17-year-olds to vote in school board elections. The research shows that you're just as mature at 16 as you're going to be in 18. They're sort of arbitrary numbers. And sort of our thinking is, if you can vote, if you can not vote, if you can get a license, if you can work, if you can do sort of other things, why wouldn't you be able to vote in these small elections, and kind of in the areas that have this provision, the towns and such, you do see higher participation. They really 16, 17-year-olds do seem to come out and vote and have that say. And specifically with school boards, it makes sense that we would want to hear from kids in schools in the same way we talk about within sort of other issues when you're doing sort of advocacy or organizing work. You want to hear from impacted communities, and not only do you want to hear their voices, you want to make sure that they are centered in the work that you're doing. And so if we're talking about schools and we're talking about educations, and school boards are looking at what resources that do we need, what are going well in our schools, what could we be improved, then yeah, you want to talk to teachers, you want to talk to parents, but you also want to talk to the kids who are in there, who can tell, we don't have enough textbooks, or, we don't have enough money for, an after school club, or, whatever the case may be. And so they have a vested interest, and we think they should be able to vote in these elections. And it does sort of make sense that, when you're 18 and kind of able to vote, you'll probably remember to vote in your big elections. I hope that you would. But, it's a crazy time figuring out, do I vote at home? Do I vote where I go to college? if they're different, kind of all of that is crazy. You don't have that habit of going to vote. And so I think if we can instill kind of voting in people a little bit younger, then that's great if we can really set them up for those foundations to be successful citizens, participating citizens further on.
Well, I remember when 18-year-olds were not, or you had to be 21.
Mhm.
I go back that far, but at 18, I mean, we were expecting young people to go to war. And so it didn't make any sense at all that they weren't given the privilege of voting, and voting is a privilege and not something to be taken lightly. So I'm wondering about this huge influx of people coming into this country, and what is the voting? What is your, can you give some insight into what happens with these people who are just coming here and don't have any command of the language yet or anything? What is going on with that as far as voting is concerned? You mentioned Sussex County. I know there are a lot of.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's be clear, to vote in any election, at least in Delaware, and I'm going to assume in most, if not all states, you have to be a citizen in order to be able to vote. So yeah, we've seen an influx of immigration, and I think that is great. I think that is what we've been founded on, and we should be welcoming the stranger, be welcoming our new neighbors every day. But I don't, there is very clear, there is no voter fraud. People aren't, jumping across the borders and coming out to vote. That's simply not happening. Again, you have to be a citizen, you have to be registered. And so if we want to talk about immigration, I'm happy to do that. But in terms of if they are voting right now, that's not happening in any sort of election right now.
Any other questions at this time? Okay, well, first and foremost, I want to thank Helen for providing such a great background and education on what's been going on at the ACLU and the coalition that you're involved in. I think more importantly, though, is we all love your passion and your excitement around these topics and the energy that you're going to put in to the future. So we appreciate your time this evening, and I hope all of you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.